Makkot Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Judgement. אפשר יכחיש אחד מהם את חברו. Judgement is probably the most important leadership quality, and one of the most difficult to define, to learn. What is it and how is it created? And as I learned through the sugya, the last piece on the first parak of Masechta Makkos, it seemed to me that that's exactly what we're dealing with the nature of judgment and the subtlety and the nuances of judgment. Rabbi Talpin and Rabbi Akiva, when Rabbi Talpin and Rabbi Akiva were teaching this last piece of the first parak of Makkos, they said, Ilu hayinu b'Sanhedrin, if we would have been dayanim in the Sanhedrin, lo neherag adam me'olam, nobody would ever have received the death sentence. The death sentence is there to be learnt, to understand the severity of a particular halacha. It's not there to be executed. A human court doesn't give a death sentence, and the crime that is committed that is a capital offense is too complex and serious for any Beis Din to give. The Torah tells us about the death sentence because we need to understand it, but we would never execute. What do they think? That's so smart. So by being kind to the perpetrators, they're being cruel to the victims. You're just going to create more crime in the world if you're going to go light on capital punishment. So it's an age-old discussion. Capital punishment, shouldn't it be? Should it be on the books? Shouldn't it be on the books? If it's on the books, should it ever be utilized? So we've got it on the books. The Torah tells us there's such a thing as capital punishment. But Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Talpin say they would never have used it. Our focus, and the focus of the Gemara, is not so much on Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, which of course is an interesting comment, but on the mechanism that Rabbi Talpin and Rabbi Akiva would have used to avoid ever having given the death sentence. What do you do if somebody's accused of a capital offense and there are witnesses and they come to court and you cross-examine the witnesses? How are you going to get out of giving the death sentence? You don't have judicial discretion. It's not as if the Torah says you may give the death sentence under those circumstances. If you have the right evidence, you have to give the death sentence. So the Gemara is going to focus on the mechanism. The first thing is, do they mean it literally? Lo neherag adam me'olam. Is that what they mean? So ask the Gemara, how would they go about it? Hechi avu avdi. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar say they would ask ridiculous questions. Re'item treifa harag. Maybe the person who was murdered was a treifa. He had a disease from which he was going to die within a year in any case, in which case he's considered as dead already, and this person murdered a dead man, not a live man. Do you know that this person wasn't suffering from a fatal illness? Shalem harag, was he complete? Were all his organs in place? Omar Ravashi, and Ravashi says, and further, imtim salema shalem, if they would say, yes, we are absolutely sure that he was suffering from no disease whatever, dilma b'mokum sayif nekev hava. Do you know that at the point of the bullet hole, there wasn't already a previous bullet hole? Do you know that this was the first person who shot him, and that there wasn't somebody who shot him in exactly that place before? How do you know? So it becomes impossible. And Rashi says on that, Shalem Harag Shiyomru Bat Kuna. How could they say we know there was nothing wrong with him? They did a post-mortem. The witnesses say after we murdered him, after he was murdered, we did a post-mortem. Elachar mitato mikol shmona esrei treifot, and we checked all 18 potential fatal illnesses, and we made sure that he was not suffering from any of them. Then we say, well, maybe it was the second bullet. And that implies, as the Ritva says, as we understand Rashi, that this lo neherag adam me'olam means literally. If you're going to go that far and say, even if they say we did a post-mortem, then you're still going to say, but maybe the bullet hole wasn't the first bullet hole, then clearly there's going to be no possibility of ever giving the death sentence, and that's what they mean. Lo neherag adam me'olam, it never happened. That's the way it would have happened. Says the Ramban, Ihachi akarta pashat rotzchin ufashat edim zomamim she'efshar le'daim b'makom saif nekava. What you've just done is you've invalidated the whole parsha, all the set of laws that govern capital offense and the principles of edim zomamim, because you can never execute on them. And why would the Torah give you something that you can never execute on? Why would the Torah have given you something with the intention that you should never execute on it? That doesn't make any sense. You've just undone the whole parsha of Rotzchim. So you've got Rashi, and Rabbi Tam also follows that school, saying it does mean literally. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Talpin would have made sure that it was never possible to give capital punishment. And the Ramban and the Ritva and Tosfos on Makkos is a late Tosfos. Tosfos on Makkos is the Talmudim of Rabbeinu Peretz, which is 13th century, same period as the Ritva and even the Ramban. The Ramban was a little bit earlier, but they take a different view, as we're going to see. So the Ritva says the Ritva was the Ramban's Talmud. The Ritva's Rebbe was the Rashba, and the Rashba's Rebbe was the Ramban. So that's a school of thought. And the Ritva and the Ramban say almost the same thing, but the Ritva adds something very, very important. Why does my Rebbe's Rebbe, the Ramban, say that this means absolute and you would undo all of the laws of Eidim Zomamin? Why is that so? Because in order to answer this in the affirmative, you would have had to have done a post-mortem with all 18 treifas. Kaminav letuva, you would desecrate the body. And you're not allowed to do that. So the law, it's quite interesting, the law of a post-mortem, of not doing a post-mortem, the Ritva learns is not just because there's a kedusha to the body doesn't belong to you, various different reasons that are given. So this is also who would want their own body to be chopped up after they're dead? We wouldn't want it done to ourselves, chas v'sholem, and we therefore certainly can't do it to anybody else. And furthermore, so he says, firstly, how would we even tolerate such a situation where in order for their evidence to be accepted, they would have to have done a post-mortem, which you're not allowed to do in the first place? That the Ritva adds, the Ramban doesn't say that. And where would you say from that if we can catch them out on this, that means if the witness were to say, well, we're not sure that he was a treifa. We can't be 100% sure that this person was not suffering from a fatal death. We would then save the accused and not give him the capital punishment. We've got a din of rov. Most people aren't suffering from fatal diseases, and you're entitled to assume that. Why are we even asking these questions? And if they come back and say, well, we don't know, how can we know if he was suffering from a fatal? Why don't we just say rov? Well, you're right. You don't know if he was suffering from a fatal disease, nor do we, the judges, the Beis Din. Therefore, we must rely on rov. Most people aren't suffering from fatal diseases. So this just doesn't make sense. So the Ritva goes on to say, Af b'zeh im lo ratzu Sanhedrin lish'ol harashut b'yadam kivan shiruba lo hayu treifa. This rov, the fact that there's a statistical majority of people who are healthy, who are not suffering from a fatal disease, allows a Beis Din to choose not to investigate that, not to go down that route at all. A Beis Din is entitled to say, we're assuming this man was a healthy man, you killed a healthy man, and therefore this is a capital offense. Ela, she'im ratzu lishol, however they have permission, they may ask. This is their judicial discretion. Their discretion is not give the death sentence or don't give the death sentence. We don't have judicial discretion over that. But there is judicial discretion as to how far to go in the cross-examination. If they want to say, can you be sure that this man didn't have a fatal disease? V'amru ha'edim ein anu yodim. And the witnesses say, how can we know that? We don't know that. Then ein mekabli medutan. Then we can say, well then, what do you know? If you don't even know whether he had a fatal disease or not, you don't know whether this man killed a live man or a dead man, then your evidence is not admissible at all. This is different from Tosfos, who holds, if they said, ein anu yodim, if they said, we don't know, we would still accept their evidence. That's not a reason to cancel their evidence. But the Beis Din would hope that ultimately they would contradict one another. And the Ritva goes in a similar vein in principle, just not on the issue of Ein Anu Yodin. So there are two ways that this Eidus could be cancelled. The Beis Din doesn't have to question whether the state of health of the victim. The Beis Din doesn't have to go there. They can rely on a rov. However, they could choose to go there and question the state of health of the victim. If the witnesses say, we checked, well, that would be crazy, say the Rishon, because you would have to have done a post-mortem. So what might they say? We don't know, or they might contradict one another. If they contradict one another, then we certainly throw out their evidence. If they say we don't know, then there's a machlokes Ramban and Ritva on the one hand, and Tosfos on the other hand. But what's important for us to focus on is the next piece of Ritva. ובזהו שאמרו רבי עקיבא ורבי טלפון שהיו מקילין משום דנפישי רוצחים בבוא עליה ראיוס. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Talfon didn't say this because they disagreed with the Torah, chas v'shalom. The Torah says this is a capital offense, and they're saying, but we wouldn't do it. We won't ever give the death sentence. No, what they were saying is normally we can lighten or go more heavily on the cross-examination, depending on whether there are a lot of murderers and bo'alei arayos. The other case the Mishnah talks about. They were only makil, meaning they would not go, they wouldn't ask the question, if there were many, many murders, or the Ritva could be saying the other way around, there were so many murderers that if they started giving the death sentence, they'd be killing a lot of people. And so they found other ways to deal with this. And we see here the discretion of the Beis Din to dial up or down the level of cross-examination to the point where Tosfos says, today I've created a bit of a narrative between the Ramban, the Ritva, and the Tosfos as one approach, although they're different, but subtly different. Lachein Nira says, Al Tosfos, Tehodeka Amar lo ne'erag adam me'olam lav dafka. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon don't mean that there would never have been a death sentence if they were on the Sanhedrin. So they deviate from Rashi. According to Rashi, it's clear that they mean that there would never have been a case. Says Tosfos, that can't possibly be what they mean. Ela rov pa'amim lo haya ne'erag. They're just saying we would have seldom implemented the death sentence. Even if there were many murderers, we would have seldom implemented the death sentence. What is our mechanism? She'al yedei shehu marbe bivdikot אפשר shelo יכחיש echad mehem et חבירו. By dialing up the detail required in the cross-examination, we would inevitably get to a point where the two witnesses give us different answers. And then we can disqualify the evidence. And it's that comment that is so interesting to me. She'al yedei shehu marbe bivdikot אפשר shelo יכחיש echad mehem et חבירו. You would think facts are facts. Two witnesses are watching the same event. Surely they're going to report the same facts. Tosfos says that's not human nature. We don't see what is there. We see what is in us. We filter what we see based on our own inevitable biases and preferences. And the more subtle the detail, the more easily it is for us to filter. And you'll often see, you know very well, you'll often, two people who were at the same shiur and they heard completely different things. Two people who saw the same event and they saw something different. Certainly when it gets to interpretation of intent, the more detail you get to, the more likely it is that an individual is blinded to some detail and sees other details. And another individual is blinded to different details that he sees, which reminds us all the time how skeptical we have to be of second-hand facts. And nearly all the facts we get, other than what we see ourselves, all the facts we get are second-hand. And to realize that even if there isn't deliberate bias, there is inevitable subconscious bias. It's not possible that two people, says Tosfos, it's not possible that two people seeing the same event will agree on all the details of the event. There will inevitably be disagreement on some of the details. And that's the mechanism that the Rabbanan use in order to find discretion in the sentence that they give, just by dialing up or down the level of detail they want from the individuals. And so when we look at reported facts, we have got to understand that we can't base our judgment on what people tell us the facts are. That can be one input. We can't base our judgment just on rov, on assumptions, chazaka, just an assumption. That also, we can't base our judgment on that. At the end of the day, judgment is based on the subtle balance between the factual information we're able to gather, the statistics, the likelihoods, the statistical likelihood that we're aware of, the assumptions we want to make, and then that intuitive sense, because what also becomes important now is the context. So there are times when the Chachomim will dial up. There are times when the Chachomim will dial down. How much detail you look for. To what degree you base your judgment on specific details over which there might be differences of opinions, or what extent you base your judgment on a general overview of what's happening. Those are decisions you make based on context. There are times when there are many murderers and they Beis Din dials up. There are times when there are not so many and they might dial down, or vice versa. Context becomes an important basis for interpretation, which is why when it comes, for example, to Shailas and Chuvas, when a posek gives an answer to a Shaila, it's very important to understand that psak was given to that person who asked the Shaila in that particular era, in that particular community, because it will vary. There will be differences from time to time and from place to place. We find even Rashi, in different sugyas, when the same sugya appears in different places of Shas, Rashi will sometimes give different perushim. He'll explain the sugya differently. And we don't ask from Rashi. It's not a contradiction, Rashi to Rashi, because Rashi looks at the context in which the sugya is being discussed. So we need to be able to do both. When we're judging, we need to be able to narrow down on detail, and we need to be able to zoom out into context and to be able to see the detail in the context, and then to use facts as they're reported, statistics as we understand them, and our own intuition to come to a judgment which hopefully is one that is close to the emes.